In this lecture segment, we are talking about the contributions of Leonardo da Vinci to portraiture. We will focus on his portrait of Ginevra da Vinci. Leonardo was the illegitimate son of a relatively well-to-do notary and comes from Vinci, so his name means Leonardo of Vinci. We call him Leonardo, not da Vinci. He spends his formative years in Florence and is apprenticed to a master in the same workshop where Botticelli was apprenticed. His formative period overlaps with the same context that produced Botticelli's Birth of Venus, a renewed interest in learning and an expansion of knowledge that found expression in many areas of human creation. At the root of Renaissance humanism is the idea that man is a creator and his creations deserve attention. Leonardo buys into this idea and writes about how, as a painter, he has the power to create beauty. He epitomizes the idea of the Renaissance genius. He did everything: architecture, engineering, botany, anatomy, painting, hydraulics, even civil engineering. And in each of these realms, his pattern was to look for a different way to do something. And he does the same thing in art, especially in painting. Although he designed sculptures, he was not a sculptor, and looked down on what he saw as a dirty profession. You are probably already familiar with his Last Supper and his Mona Lisa, so we are going to look at a portrait of his from the 1470s that you can see in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery of Art. This portrait will introduce us to his artistic interests and his approach to art making, and will also be an example of his inclination to overhaul how a particular type of iconography is typically shown. He paints this depiction of Ginevra da Vinci, the daughter of a Florentine banker, when he's just 21 years old. He is still in Florence. He has not yet painted the Last Supper in Milan. He's at the beginning of his career, and he uses this commission to experiment. We can even see his fingerprint in the paint right here. Portraits are usually commissioned by a patron. The patron who pays for the work of art to be made can be the sitter, the person shown in the portrait, or it could be a family member or friend who is paying for the portrait. In this case, we have two possibilities. It could have been commissioned by her family or her fiancé on the occasion of her engagement at the age of 16, or the patron could have been Bernardo Bembo, the Venetian ambassador to Florence, who was a friend of the sitter. We see the sitter in three-quarter view. This is different than seeing someone frontally in an iconic way, or in profile, as we see in this example of another Italian Renaissance portrait that was made at the same time as the portrait of Ginevra. Portraits in profile do not capture as much of the personality of the sitter and do not engage with the viewer. Ginevra, by contrast, looks towards the viewer. In this example, we see jewelry and fine clothes. Portraits were often expressions of status and wealth. But in Leonardo's portrait, she wears nice clothes, but not jewels that would have spoken of her father's or fiancé's wealth. On the back of this portrait, we learn of her piety and her virtues. And we learn about that in Leonardo's as well. Ginevra is surrounded by a juniper bush, which in Italian is a pun for her name, as well as a statement about her virtue or chastity, which is an important characteristic for any Italian woman at this time. But we also see her personal motto, "Beauty adorns virtue," on the reverse of the portrait, with a sprig of juniper, a laurel, and a palm, symbols of her intelligence and morality. The laurel and palm may relate to the emblem of the Venetian ambassador who had a platonic friendship with Ginevra, and his motto is actually beneath hers. At some point, Leonardo altered the painting from showing his motto to showing hers, and painted over his motto. Instead of the pasty, planar, and geometric form of this contemporary portrait, Leonardo carefully models the face of Ginevra in gentle gradations of light and dark called chiaroscuro, producing a softly modeled face. He wrote about how to depict light and dark in a painting, using an outdoor courtyard, painting the four walls black, and hanging a sheet of linen over the space so that soft diffused light would come through, helping him to paint figures not with stark, harsh lighting, but with gentle lighting that would more naturalistically capture the effects of light. He also uses atmospheric perspective, a way of showing the recession into space by making objects further away blurry and bluish, as you see in the landscape in the distance. The portrait has been cut down, meaning that at some point the wood panel was cut and we lost major portions of the image. Here you see a reconstruction of how it may have looked, with Ginevra's hands prominently placed, holding a sprig of flowers, similar to the position of hands in a drawing Leonardo made at around the time he was working on the portrait. His use of oil paint also helped him capture the effects of light and softly model Ginevra's form, in addition to helping him create details in the plants, setting, and clothing. The color of the painting has changed over time and darkened, obscuring some of the careful details he included. Leonardo alters the conventions of portraiture, giving us a greater understanding of this intriguing woman. We learn something about her as an individual, as a thinker. He created a lifelike depiction that has her looking at us and engaging with the viewer, in part due to the three-quarter pose. The chiaroscuro and careful structuring of the light and dark relationships in the scene help focus our attention on her and heighten the feeling of her being present with us. We learn more about her and her accomplishments and interests than we learn about her father or fiancé. We don't see jewelry or fancy clothing. We see evidence of her intellectual life in the symbols shown and in her motto. Leonardo only painted a handful of portraits, but in doing so he totally changed the conventions of portraiture. Here, for example, is the Mona Lisa from about 25 years later. The figure is shown in three-quarter view with that soft chiaroscuro to model her face and hands. We have atmospheric perspective again, with the addition of sfumato, which is the smoky haziness that Leonardo often uses in his paintings, another expression of his interest in light and how to best represent light and dark in paintings. And if we compare this to an official photograph of Michelle Obama when she was First Lady, we can see how very influential this alteration to the conventions of portraiture is. We have three-quarter view, hands positioned in front of the body, and the sitter looks at the viewer and engages with the audience. Leonardo's propensity to overhaul conventions of art is a defining feature of his career and another manifestation of the Renaissance. He was not particularly interested in classical learning or in Christianity, but he was a voracious learner whose work epitomizes the intellectual revival of this age.